Everyone pictures the same thing when they hear German Army 1940. Tanks pouring across a border, Stukas screaming down, a lightning war of engines and steel. Here is the part nobody shows you. The real backbone of that army, more than 100 of its divisions, had almost no tanks at all. A single German infantry division was a small city of roughly 17,000 people, sorted into 14 completely different jobs, and most of them never fired a shot at the enemy. And the thing actually holding it together? Not engines. We will get to that. Let us take one apart, piece by piece. Division headquarters. Start with the brain, because 17,000 people with no brain is just a mob. The headquarters itself was tiny, a few hundred staff, and the real work ran through a handful of key officers you could fit on a single bus. The general got the credit. But the man who actually moved the division was the operations officer, the IA, who turned two words, "take that town," into synchronized orders for regiments, artillery, engineers, supply and signals all firing off at once. Think of running a 17,000-employee company off a management team of about a dozen people, with no email, half your phone lines cut, and everyone shooting at you. The headquarters did not fight. It pointed. And what it pointed were three heavy fists. Infantry Regiments. Those fists were the three infantry regiments, about 3,000 men each, a sold-out concert crowd, each one carrying the division's name, its number, and its pride into the mud. This was the part that closed with the enemy, rifle to rifle. Each regiment could fight semi-independently, swing left, swing right, hold a village, storm a ridge, or cover the other two. On paper, it looks clean, 3 regiments, 1 division, done. But a regiment is still an abstraction. 3,000 men is a number too big to actually picture. To see where the war was really fought, won, and died, you have to zoom in one more level to the piece that did the bleeding. Infantry Battalions. 9 battalions, 3 inside each regiment, and the battalion, 860 men in 1939, was the smallest chunk that could truly fight on its own, with its own rifle companies and its own heavy company of machine guns and mortars. This is where the war actually lived, not in sweeping arrows on a map, but in one battalion pinned in a tree line, a single machine gun scything across a wheat field, a mortar dropping shells behind a stone wall onto men it could not even see. Stack it all together, and the division put out 442 machine guns and 135 mortars, a wall of automatic fire that dwarfed any French, British, or Polish division of 1939. By 1944, that 860-man battalion had shrunk to 708. The bucket was leaking men, and it never stopped. But here is the thing about all those rifles and machine guns. They were not what killed most of the soldiers who died in this war. Artillery Regiment. That was this. The Artillery Regiment was the division's real killer, and it was not even close. Across the whole Second World War, more men were killed by shell fire than by bullets, cut down by guns they never saw, fired by crews who never saw them, sometimes from 6 or 7 miles away. This regiment stacked 3 battalions of 105mm field howitzers, 36 guns, behind one heavy battalion of 150mm howitzers, and the light guns alone could reach out nearly 7 miles. The way it worked was almost surgical. A forward observer crawling with the infantry would radio back a map reference, and 60 seconds later, the world would end for whoever was standing on that spot. Nearly 2,900 men served the guns, and hauling them took 2,208 horses. Hold that number. It is about to matter more than anything else in this video. Those howitzers could smash a tank too, in theory. In practice, the division had a specialist for that job, and it carried one of the cruelest nicknames of the entire war. If a field howitzer designed from the 1930s out killing every machine gun is already mess with your head, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel because the units coming up get stranger and the last one quietly rewrites the whole story. Antitank Battalion. Meet the door knocker. The division's dedicated tank killer was the 37mm Pake 36, a gun so light, around 432 kilograms, that 2 men could manhandle it into a ditch and 250 rounds sat ready beside it. In Poland in 1939, it was lethal, punching straight through thin-skinned Polish tanks. Then came France, May 1940, and the crews watched in genuine horror as their shells slammed into British Matildas and French Char B-1s and simply bounced off, sparking away into the dirt. At Arras, a handful of those heavy British tanks nearly broke a German advance, and it took 88mm anti-aircraft guns, barrels cranked down flat, to finally stop them, not the little 37. The soldiers gave the Pak 36 a bitter name, Heer Sanklopfgerät, the army door knocker, because all it did was knock politely and announce exactly where you were hiding. Against the Soviet T-34 in 1941, from the front it was useless. Germany rushed out the 50mm Pak 38 and then the 75mm Pak 40 to replace it. But for the first years, this was the division's answer to enemy armor. And to even find those tanks before they arrived, the division needed eyes. Eyes that, unbelievably, rode on horseback. Reconnaissance Battalion. Because the division's scouts were in part actual cavalry, around 216 horsemen, riders with saber-and-all lineage, in the war we remember for panzers, the living leftovers of Germany's disbanded cavalry regiments. They kept wearing cavalry insignia right up until September 1943. Mounted troopers, bicycle companies, and a few armored cars, all ranging kilometers ahead of the marching column to sniff out the enemy before the enemy found them, and to get the first, often fatal, look at what was waiting. And here is the quiet truth almost no one knows. The reconnaissance and anti-tank battalions were the only genuinely mobile parts of the entire division. Everything else moved at a walk. By 1945, even the horsemen were gone, stripped away as the army bled out. When those scouts found a bunker line they could not ride around, the division sent in a unit most people assume just fixes roads and builds bridges. Engineer Battalion. Wrong. The Pionieri were not handymen. They were assault troops, some of the deadliest men in the division. In the German army, the engineers led attacks. When the infantry ran into a fortress line and stalled, it was the pioneers who crawled the last 50 yards with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and wire cutters to burn and blast a concrete bunker open at point-blank range. Yes, they laid the pontoon bridges, cleared the minefields, and built the crossings too. But their signature job, when it turned truly ugly, was sprinting the final stretch to a pillbox with a tank of burning fuel strapped to their back. A third company was added to them in 1939 because the German way of war demanded more men willing to do exactly that, and few of them lasted long. Now, all these pieces, riflemen, gunners, scouts, and engineers, had to talk to each other in real time, and the unit that made that possible was almost completely invisible. Signal Battalion. The Nachrichten Battalion was the division's nervous system, radios, field telephones, kilometers of copper wire spooled out across shell-torn ground, buried, cut, and spliced back together again, often under fire, by men nobody ever thanks in a war movie. It was the least glamorous job in the whole division, and one of the most decisive, because it was the entire difference between 17,000 people fighting as a single coordinated machine and 17,000 people fighting as a confused, deaf crowd. Radios were scarce and easily overheard, so most of it came down to wire, which meant men crawling out to re-splice a line the instant it was cut. Cut the signals, and both sides tried constantly, and the division went blind and stupid within minutes, its regiments swinging in the dark, its artillery firing at nothing. But no matter how well it fought, this machine bled, relentlessly. And someone had to keep refilling it with human beings. Field Replacement Battalion. That was the Feldersatz Battalion, and it is a dark little cog once you see what it actually did. It held fresh recruits close behind the front, trained and waiting, ready to be fed straight into the line the moment men fell, replacements for the dead, the wounded, the frozen, the simply gone. A division in heavy fighting on the Eastern Front could lose thousands in a single week. This battalion was the only thing keeping the whole formation from dissolving into nothing but a number on a map. Picture topping off a bucket that has a hole shot clean through the bottom, over and over, for years on end. And the men who drained out the other way, the torn-up ones, went to a unit that spent its entire war working in blood. Medical units. Aid posts, field dressing stations, stretcher bearers running into open fire to drag a screaming man back by his webbing straps, surgeons operating by lamplight with the front a few miles off and getting closer by the hour, sawing and stitching faster than the wounded could arrive. This is where the clean word casualty on a headquarters chart turned into a real 19-year-old, losing a leg on a table that used to be a farmhouse door. The medical companies were the division's conscience and its repair shop for human flesh, and they were overwhelmed almost everywhere the fighting got serious. But not everyone who left the firing line was wounded. Some men simply ran, and the division kept a group of its own whose job was to hunt them down. Military police. The Feldgendarmerie. The frontline troops had a name for them, Kettenhunde, chained dogs. Because of the metal gorget, every one of them wore on a chain around his neck, catching the light like a badge nobody wanted to see. They directed the endless traffic that kept a division moving, herded prisoners to the rear, and rounded up stragglers. And in the last desperate years of the war, they took on the grimmest task of all, hunting deserters and hanging them from trees and lampposts, bodies left dangling with cardboard signs around their necks as a warning to every soldier marching past. The chained dogs were how the machine kept its own men from breaking and running. And that machine, every gun, every man, every ounce of fear still had to be fed, fueled, and fixed. Start with fixed maintenance and workshop units. The workshop companies kept the trucks, the guns, and the division's handful of motor vehicles alive, armorers, mechanics, and welders patching up whatever the war chewed apart, often cannibalizing 3 wrecks to rebuild one usable machine, because new parts might be 1,000 miles and a bombed rail line away. But here is where the whole picture starts to tilt on its side. A German infantry division did not actually have that many engines to fix in the first place. Most of its so-called transport did not run on gasoline at all. Most of it had 4 legs and a heartbeat, which is exactly why the thing physically carrying this entire army forward across Europe was not a fleet of trucks. Supply and transport units. It was wagons. The supply columns hauled ammunition, food, fuel, and fodder up to the front every single day, and this division was so self-contained that it baked its own bread in a field bakery company and slaughtered its own meat with its own butcher company. But the transport doing the heavy lifting, the thing actually dragging the tonnage forward mile after mile, was mostly not motorized. It was horse-drawn carts, thousands of them strung out along the roads, and feeding the animals that pulled those carts became a monster all its own. A single division's horses ate their way through tons of grain and hay a day, so much that fodder was one of the heaviest things the supply train had to move. Which brings us to the single most surprising unit in the entire 17,000-person division, the one that quietly explains everything you just heard. Veterinary Unit. The German Infantry Division carried an entire unit of animal doctors, veterinarians, farriers to shoe hooves, a mobile horse hospital to treat the wounded and the sick, and the reason is a number that snaps the whole Blitzkrieg myth clean in half. A single German infantry division ran on roughly 5,000 horses, not as a symbol. 5,000 living, breathing animals hauling the howitzers, the ammunition wagons, and the rolling field kitchens, roughly 1 horse for every 3 or 4 men in the division. Now zoom all the way out, and it gets almost unbelievable. The mechanized Wehrmacht entered the war with 514,000 horses, and burned through 2.75 million of them before it was over, keeping around 1.1 million in service at any given moment. One horse for every 6 soldiers in the entire army. Of 264 divisions active in November 1944, only 42 were truly mechanized. So this unit, the vets, the blacksmiths, the men crouched in freezing mud trying to shoe a panicking animal, was every bit as essential as the gunners, because the day a horse died in the snow outside Moscow, a gun stopped moving. Full stop. It could not advance, and it could not retreat. The Lightning War, it turns out, mostly walked, at the speed of a tired, hungry horse. So the image in your head from the very start, the tanks, the engines, the lightning, is about half a lie. Behind the few fast panzer divisions marched 100 of these 17,000 people and 5,000 horses, sorted into 14 different jobs, most of them on foot, bleeding, baking bread, stringing wire in the dark, and burying dead animals in the snow. That was the real machine that overran a continent in 1940, and then got slowly ground to pieces on the endless, bottomless roads to Moscow and Stalingrad. Not because the enemy suddenly had better tanks, because a horse can only pull a gun so far before it starves, freezes, or drops in the mud, and no amount of courage on earth refills 2.75 million of them. If you made it all the way to the horses, you already beat the algorithm. So, hit subscribe and share this with the history buff in your life who still thinks the Wehrmacht ran on gasoline. Next, we are taking apart the machine on the other side of that frozen front, how a Soviet rifle division was built from the ground up to bury exactly this one.